We talk about the Kurds sort of monolithically, and they sort of straddle 4 different countries, actually 5 if you include Armenia, in the region. Let's bring up a map here and actually show our viewers, because they're anywhere, estimates range from about 20 to 35 million Kurds in these countries you can see here. Now, Turkey, we know well, the PKK is based there. Southeastern Turkey is by far perhaps the largest grouping of Kurds in the region, up to perhaps 18 to 20 million, about 15%, if not more, of Turkey's total population. But we also obviously have them in northeastern Syria, in northern Iraq, in western Iran, as we can see, they're straddling the border with both Iraq and Turkey, and also in southwestern Armenia. And like I said, tens of millions of them. It's interesting because they're the 4th largest ethnic group in the Middle East. They've never had a state of their own. They were very briefly promised such a state way back in 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres. There's something for some history trivia for you. 3 years later, you had another treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne, in which they were disappointed. Their hopes for autonomy were dashed. And they've been sort of struggling for autonomy ever since. But I think the main thing to keep in mind is this map here makes it look like they're just sort of one big lump, all the Kurds, in these 4 countries. Yes, they have a common language, although dialects differ. Yes, they have a common culture. Yes, common race, ethnicity. But they do have lots of divisions when it comes to sort of how they see this conflict. When the Islamic State group first started overrunning large swathes of territory a few years back in both Syria and Iraq, what you had is a lot of the Peshmerga Kurdish forces all grouping together in various ways, shapes, and forms to sort of fight off the Islamic State group. And to varying degrees, they have used this fight and the support they've had in it from outside, especially in northern Syria, the U.S. and the Kurds, the U.S. relying heavily on the Kurds as what they say is an effective fighting force against the Islamic State group. They've used that external support to advance their cause for autonomy, and that is a cause which, as we saw from our previous report, has really haunted Turkey. Turkey sees the Kurds as a real bogeyman in this entire scenario, even in that fight against the Islamic State group.
Well, as you say, there's so much hate between Turkey and Kurdish groups, but the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is set to meet with the leader of the Kurds. How are these talks going ahead?
Well, this is very complicated because the leader of Iraqi Kurdistan, a man named Masoud Barzani, he is indeed going to be meeting with Erdogan, also with the Prime Minister of Turkey, also with the Foreign Minister, and perhaps even with Joe Biden, the U.S. Vice President, who's going to be flying into Ankara, the Turkish capital, tomorrow. And it's interesting there because I was talking about the Kurds basically being, all united in their struggle against the Islamic State group, their struggle for autonomy. Barzani, ironically, has been seen as an ally of Erdogan. Erdogan, the same man who calls the Turkish Kurdish fighters, the PKK group, terrorists. Barzani, through a lot of oil deals, through a lot of history and geopolitics, tricky politics, has become sort of an ally. He met with Erdogan back in December 2015 for the last time. Back then, they were talking about what was even then and now an impending operation to recapture Mosul in Iraq from the Islamic State group, by far the largest city they hold, and also in more generally the fight against the Islamic State group. So they're more allies, much more allies than enemies. Barzani has had his own political motives. He's been president of the Iraqi Kurdish area since 2005. It will be interesting to see sort of the dynamic between these two less than a year after their last meeting, but they will have no shortage of topics to discuss. I want to briefly, before leaving you, just show you one thing. Map of Syria showing the area right now that the Kurds, can we perhaps bring that up for our viewers? The area that the Kurds right now hold in Syria, northern Syria. It's very tricky there because you can see there's a big swathe of yellow there. That is the area held by Kurdish forces in northern Syria. Turkey is very, very wary of this. They don't want the Kurds to have an entire swathe of territory across all of northern Syria. You might see a tiny little splotch of yellow on the far left side of that map. It's broken up by a little corridor. That gray corridor there is still territory held by the Islamic State group, and that is territory that the Kurds, allied to some extent with some Arab forces, are trying to recapture. Turkey looks at that with a lot of trepidation. The last thing Turkey wants to see is that corridor linked up in one continuous Kurdish territory. The question is, I have no clear answer for this, what's more important to Turkey? Driving the Islamic State group out of that swathe of area, that corridor in northern Syria, getting them out of there, or preventing the Kurds from linking up a contiguous territory in northern Syria, an autonomous territory that would further consolidate their claim perhaps to an independent state. Very tight balance, for a difficult balance and juggling act for Erdogan.
And